The Wehrmacht soldier, who boarded that train in the summer of 1943, carried more than his rucksack and whatever fragments of personal effects the Americans had let him keep. He carried an entire cosmology, a vision of the world, meticulously constructed through years of Nazi propaganda, Hitler youth meetings, newsreels showing Allied cities burning, and the ironclad certainty that Germany was the mightiest industrial power on earth, destined to rule an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. The average German prisoner arriving at East Coast ports had been told his entire adult life that America was a decadent nation of jazz-addled mongrels. Its cities crumbling, its factories rusting, its people soft and incapable of sustained warfare. He had seen the newsreels of breadlines during the Depression. He had heard the propaganda ministry's careful explanations of how Jewish financiers had hollowed out the American economy. When he surrendered in North Africa or was captured in Italy, he expected to be shipped to a prison camp resembling the industrial death facilities he knew existed in the East, or at minimum the grim fortresses where his own country warehoused Allied prisoners on starvation rations. The German soldier of 1943 had been psychologically prepared for brutality because brutality was all he knew. The Wehrmacht's own treatment of Soviet prisoners had killed roughly 3 million men through deliberate starvation, exposure, and murder. The soldier understood that war meant certain categories of human beings simply ceased to exist, their bodies bulldozed into mass graves or left to freeze on the roadside. When the hatch of the transport ship opened in New York Harbor, he fully expected to see a bombed-out wasteland resembling the photographs of London after the Blitz. Perhaps worse, since American weakness would have left the homeland even more vulnerable. What he saw instead would begin the slow-motion demolition of everything he believed about the world, his nation, and himself. What the prisoners didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that the Americans had prepared something far more devastating than brutality. They had prepared a window seat. By the summer of 1943, the logistics problem facing the United States military was unprecedented in scope. The Africa Corps had surrendered in May, flooding American hands with tens of thousands of battle-hardened German soldiers who needed to be processed, housed, and, ideally, prevented from causing trouble for the duration of the war. North Carolina became the first state to receive German prisoners, but the numbers quickly overwhelmed East Coast capacity. The solution was elegantly simple and, as it turned out, accidentally devastating to Nazi ideology. Ship them inland. Scatter them across the heartland, where they could provide agricultural labor to replace the American men fighting overseas, and where the sheer distance from any coastline made escape functionally pointless. The War Department estimated that as many as 500,000 prisoners might eventually require housing. They needed camps in Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Nebraska, Arizona, states most German soldiers had never heard of, in a country they had been told was smaller and weaker than the Reich. Then came the trains. Rather than being loaded into the cattle cars that moved German troops, and, though most prisoners did not yet know it, Jewish civilians to their deaths across Europe, the German soldiers were escorted to gleaming Pullman coaches. The cars had upholstered seats. Some had dining facilities. The windows were large and, critically, unshaded for much of the journey. American guards stood at the ends of each car, armed but relaxed, offering cigarettes and making small talk with prisoners who spoke English. One prisoner later recalled that guards apologized because the air conditioning wasn't working properly. The German soldiers exchanged bewildered glances. They had been prisoners for less than 48 hours, and already nothing made sense. The train lurched out of the station and began rolling west. The journey to Camp Concordia, Kansas, would take approximately 3 days. 72 hours of uninterrupted exposure to a nation that should not have existed, according to everything they had been taught. The prisoners pressed their faces to the windows like children at a zoo, except they were beginning to suspect that they were the ones in the cage. What they witnessed through that glass over the next 3 days would accomplish what no Allied bombing campaign, no battlefield defeat, no propaganda leaflet could ever achieve. The systematic annihilation of Nazi ideology, measured not in casualties but in miles. The train had barely cleared the switching yards when the first cracks appeared. The German prisoners, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front or the North African campaign, stared through the Pullman windows at a city that refused to conform to anything Goebbels had shown them in the newsreels. The skyline was intact. The streets teemed with automobiles. Civilian automobiles, not military vehicles, not the desperate improvised transport of a nation under siege. Factories belched smoke, not in isolated pockets, but in continuous ribbons stretching to the horizon, their windows glowing even in daylight, indicating multiple shifts working around the clock. One prisoner, who had fought in Rommel's Afrika Korps, later described the sensation as vertigo. The ground had shifted beneath us, and we had not moved. The psychological impact of the skyline alone was substantial, but it was only the appetizer. As the train pushed through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, the prisoners encountered their first sustained exposure to American industrial capacity. Pittsburgh presented itself as a city-sized foundry, its steel mills throwing sparks into the night sky, its smokestacks numbering in the hundreds where German cities might have dozens. The prisoners had been told that America's industrial base was concentrated in a few vulnerable cities, easily targeted by Luftwaffe strategic bombing once the Reich had secured the Atlantic approaches. What they saw from the train windows was the opposite. Redundancy upon redundancy, factory after factory, each facility larger than anything they had seen outside the Ruhr Valley. And the Ruhr Valley was Germany's single greatest industrial concentration. America seemed to have a Ruhr Valley every 50 miles. One documented observation that circulated among the prisoners concerned an aluminum plant visible from certain rail lines. The facility stretched 3 miles along the riverbank, its electric furnaces consuming 175,000 kilowatts of power. More electricity, as one prisoner with engineering training calculated, than the entire city of Munich. This single factory, in a state most Germans couldn't locate on a map, produced more aluminum than Germany's entire scattered network of plants operating under constant threat of Allied bombardment. The prisoner who made this calculation reportedly fell silent and did not speak again for the rest of the day. His comrades noted that he had been one of the most ardent National Socialists in their unit. The meals served on the train administered a second shock, quieter but equally devastating. The German soldiers had spent months on diminishing rations as supply lines stretched and broke. Many had surrendered partially out of hunger, their bodies weakened by caloric deficits that Wehrmacht logisticians could no longer address. Now they sat in upholstered seats while American servicemen handed them meals that exceeded in quantity and quality anything they had eaten since the early days of the war. White bread, fresh meat, butter, actual butter, not the margarine substitutes that had become standard throughout the Reich. Coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz grain-based alternatives that had become standard throughout Germany. One prisoner's account records his astonishment at watching American crew members dump uneaten food into garbage bins. The ship's crew disposed of more food waste each day than his entire company had received in weekly rations during the final months in Africa. The abundance was almost obscene. It suggested reserves so deep that waste was inconsequential, and waste on a scale that would have seemed criminal in Germany. As the train crossed the Appalachians and descended into the Ohio River Valley, the psychological assault intensified. The factories had been impressive, but perhaps explicable. America had been at peace while Germany fought, so of course their plants were intact. But the farmland was something else entirely. The German prisoners, many of them sons of Bavarian peasants or Prussian agricultural labourers, watched the landscape transform into an unbroken sea. of cultivated abundance that stretched past the limits of vision. The fields were not the carefully terraced plots of Central Europe. Each acre wrested from difficult soil through generations of labour. These were industrial operations spanning thousands of acres, worked by machines rather than men, their productivity multiplied by technology that German agriculture could only dream about. Hour after hour, the wheat fields rolled past. The prisoners began counting telephone poles, counting farms, counting grain elevators that appeared every few miles along the rail line, each one capable of storing more grain than an entire German village could produce in a season. The automobile sightings accumulated with particular weight. German propaganda had promised the Volkswagen, the people's car that would democratize ownership throughout the Reich. The factories had been converted to war production. No civilian Volkswagens had been delivered. In America, the highways ran thick with private vehicles, not military trucks, not staff cars for officers. Ordinary automobiles owned by ordinary workers, farmers, shopkeepers. One prisoner counted cars visible from the train, and the mathematics became unbearable. His entire division had possessed fewer trucks for military transport. The mathematics were destroying everything. The prisoners began to understand that they had been lied to, but the full scope of the lie revealed itself mile by mile. They watched American logistics unfold across the landscape. Supply chains feeding supply chains feeding supply chains. A continent organized for industrial warfare on a scale that German planners had never imagined possible. The American guards seemed almost bored by the journey. They had grown up with this. They did not understand that they were showing prisoners something more devastating than any battlefield defeat. They did not understand that every mile was killing something inside the German soldiers, who stared through Pullman glass with eyes that no longer held hope. Kansas arrived on the third day, and the wheat stretched to every horizon. The prisoners had seen fields before. They had crossed the agricultural regions of 3 continents. Nothing had prepared them for this. The golden waves rolled unbroken from the rail line to the limits of vision, shimmering in August heat, covering more acreage in a single glance than entire German districts contained. The Reich was bleeding divisions to hold territory in the east that could never match what scrolled past the windows of a Pullman coach crossing Kansas. The train slowed. The prisoners leaned forward. The guards announced arrival. The doors opened. August Kansas heat flooded in, carrying with it the smell of wheat and the silence of men who had run out of words. The psychological collapse that began on the train ripened into systematic despair over the following weeks. Prisoners who had been ardent National Socialists upon capture became withdrawn and reflective. Prisoners who had defended the war's necessity began privately acknowledging its futility. American intelligence officers documented what they termed ideological collapse syndrome, spreading through the camp population like an epidemic. The prisoners could not communicate what they had seen to their families in Germany. Camp mail was censored. The censors would never pass descriptions of American abundance that contradicted official propaganda. But the prisoners talked among themselves, and the conversations followed predictable patterns. First came denial. The factories were facades. The food was a temporary trick. The Americans were staging an elaborate deception to break German morale. Then came rationalization. Perhaps America's industry would collapse once it tried to sustain a 2-front war. Perhaps German wonder weapons would negate the material advantage. Perhaps the trains had followed a carefully selected route designed to maximize the psychological impact. Then came acceptance. Usually within weeks of arrival, almost always beginning with the same quiet admission. The war was already lost. Germany was fighting a power that could produce more in one county than the Reich could secure through conquest. The train journey had administered the verdict. The camp was merely the holding cell while the formalities concluded. The meals continued the psychological assault. German prisoners in American custody consumed between 3,200 and 4,000 calories daily. German civilians during the same period received approximately 1,200 calories. The weekly ration for POWs included 3/4 of a pound of meat, 1 pound of potatoes, half a pound of vegetables, 3/4 of a pound of bread. German housewives could only dream of obtaining such quantities. The irony was almost too pointed to process. Wehrmacht soldiers captured by the enemy were eating better than their own families at home. Men who had surrendered as walking skeletons found themselves gaining weight, regaining strength, healthier than they had been since the war began. The food was itself a weapon. It demonstrated productive capacity that Germany could not match. It proved abundance so deep that waste was inconsequential. Every meal said the same thing the train windows had said: you never had a chance. You were fighting something you could not defeat. The hardcore Nazis responded with violence. Within the camps, a shadow system emerged where committed National Socialists identified prisoners who questioned the war or expressed anti-Nazi sentiments. The process was called the Holy Ghost. Suspected traitors were beaten. Some were murdered. Those convicted of disloyalty by the internal hierarchy sometimes met suspicious deaths officially recorded as suicides. At Camp Concordia, specifically, Captain Tropschuh was beaten by Nazi prisoners and subsequently found hanging. Authorities accepted the death as suicide. Other prisoners refused to attend his funeral and demanded he be buried outside the cemetery boundary. The violence reflected the desperation of true believers confronting the demolition of their worldview. If they could not silence the doubters would multiply. If they could not maintain the faith would die. 14 Germans were eventually executed after the war for murdering 3 fellow prisoners. 8 others served prison time for additional murders. The rage was the last gasp of an ideology bleeding out on the wheat fields of Kansas. The formal re-education program operated under the Special Projects Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davison, a poet and professor who had identified 85 anti-Nazi prisoners willing to serve as intellectual leaders. They produced Der Ruf, a newspaper distributed throughout the camp system, exposing prisoners to uncensored war news and democratic political theory. Eleanor Roosevelt herself had intervened after journalist Dorothy Thompson brought news of continuing Nazi terror within the camps. Roosevelt met with Major Maxwell McKnight, a Yale graduate running camp operations, and subsequently invited him to dinner at the White House. President Franklin Roosevelt authorized expanded re-education efforts. The prisoners watched newsreels showing Allied progress that directly contradicted the victory reports being broadcast on German radio. They saw documentation of concentration camps whose existence most Wehrmacht soldiers had not known or had chosen not to believe. But the oral histories collected decades later tell a consistent story. The formal program mattered less than the train ride. The re-education lectures confirmed what the windows had already shown. The newspaper articles documented what the factories had already demonstrated. By the time prisoners sat down to watch films about American democracy, most had already reached the essential conclusion through direct observation. They had been lied to, comprehensively and systematically, for their entire adult lives. The train journey didn't teach them about America. It taught them about Germany, about the regime that had manipulated them, about the propaganda that had deceived them, about the war that had consumed their youth for a cause built on fantasy. The escape statistics tell the final story of psychological capitulation. 2,222 escape attempts from a population exceeding 425,000 represents a rate so low as to suggest either exceptional security or exceptional passivity. The security was notably relaxed. Prisoners worked on farms without armed supervision. They attended local churches. They interacted with American civilians in town squares. They could have escaped. Most simply had nowhere to go. The train journey had shown them a nation so vast that escape to a neutral country was geographically impossible. The alternative was returning to a Germany obviously losing the war. Only 7 prisoners remained unaccounted for at repatriation. The window seats had done their work more thoroughly than any barbed wire fence. The war ended in May 1945, but the prisoners did not go home. The State Department reclassified them as surrendered enemy personnel to avoid Geneva Convention provisions requiring rapid return. They remained through 1945, through 1946, providing agricultural labour that the war-depleted American workforce desperately needed. At Fort Eustis, Virginia, prisoners organised passive resistance specifically to delay repatriation. They destroyed identification papers. They feigned illness. They failed democracy screenings. They engaged in work slowdowns. They had seen Germany's cities burning in newsreels. They knew what waited across the Atlantic: rubble, starvation, Soviet occupation zones, the destruction of everything they had known. America, by contrast, was everything they had glimpsed through train windows: intact, abundant, a future rather than merely an aftermath. Between 5,000 and 10,000 German prisoners eventually immigrated to the United States legally, returning to the country that had held them captive. Some settled in the same Kansas towns they had glimpsed at 40 miles per hour through Pullman glass. Approximately 1% of the total prisoner population remained in America permanently, building families in Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska. Georg Gärtner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico in September 1945 and remained at large until 1985. He surrendered voluntarily and became a naturalized American citizen in 2009. Even he chose to stay. Documentary crews tracked surviving prisoners in subsequent decades and found a consistent pattern. Asked about combat, men spoke briefly and moved on. Asked about the train ride, they spoke for hours. One 87-year-old former Unteroffizier sat before cameras in 2003 and delivered the verdict that summarized everything. "I fought for 3 years. I lost the war in 72 hours. His grandson lives in Denver." The most devastating weapon America deployed against Nazi ideology wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a bullet. It wasn't a propaganda leaflet dropped from B-17S over burning cities. It was a window seat on a transcontinental train. 72 hours of uninterrupted exposure to a nation that should not have existed according to everything the passengers had been taught. The German soldiers who stepped off that train in Kansas had already surrendered in ways the Wehrmacht High Command would not acknowledge for another 2 years. They had seen the future. It stretched to every horizon, golden with wheat they could never harvest, powered by factories they could never match, populated by the polyglot democracy that was supposed to be weakness incarnate, but had somehow become the most powerful nation on earth. The prisoners who arrived at camps across Kansas in 1943 were Wehrmacht soldiers. The men who emerged in 1946 were something else. Not converts to American ideology necessarily, but survivors of perhaps the most thorough psychological demolition in modern military history. Accomplished without coercion, without violence, without even the deliberate intention of their captors. The train had done the work. The windows had done the work. America, in its vast and casual abundance, had done the work simply by existing, visible through glass, for 72 uninterrupted hours. By the time the doors opened, the Wehrmacht had already surrendered. They just didn't know it yet.